Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first webinar for the year, where we'll discuss what's on the tech policy agenda for 2024. I'm Michael Lewis, auDA's Industry Relations Manager, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming to you from today, the original home of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. We also acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples were the first peoples to innovate and use technology on this land, and do so over many millennia, and knowledge upon which we continue to build today. Please note this session is being recorded. Well, we finished 2023 with the hype around generative AI continuing to build, and different industries trying to find ways to integrate into their platforms, and different governments trying to find ways to regulate it. And this year's already started off with big smartphone brands trying to work the generative AI into their latest products. Last year, the Australian government also released its long-awaited cybersecurity strategy and accompanying integration plan. auDA was pleased to see some strong language around the importance of multi-stakeholder engagement in that strategy. In fact, the government noted the success criteria. One of the success criteria would be that the internet is open, free, secure, and interoperable, with responsible and accountable multi-stakeholder management and governance. This year could take us many ways. Some particular major events that could reshape the global internet governance landscape, with discussions underway for a global digital compact at the UN Summit for the Future, and the Net Mundial +10 event, +10 meeting in Brazil. And to give us their thoughts on what policymakers will be debating, and hopefully those policymakers, including the rest of us in their discussion and consultation, we're joined by three tech experts. Simon Bush is the CEO of the Australian Information Industry Association. Simon represents Australia's tech sector to government, industry, and media. He's also been appointed to numerous government advisory committees covering digital health, procurement, and skills in cybersecurity. We're also joined by Dr. Kate Bauer, currently a fellow at the UTS Human Technology Institute, where her work focuses on AI regulation and facial recognition technology. Kate is currently on sabbatical from her role as a consumer data advocate at Choice, Australia's largest consumer organisation, in which she leads advocacy on data misuse, privacy, and reform and AI regulation. And Frank Zeichner, who is a thought leader in the adoption of Internet of Things. He's also the founding CEO of the Internet of Things Alliance of Australia, the peak body that drives collaboration across industry, research, government, and community to improve Australia's competitiveness and the lives of Australians. Frank is also a board member of the New South Wales Smart Sensing Network. As always, throughout these events, we welcome your questions, so please feel free to put them into the Zoom Q&A tab, and I'll fire them at our panelists as we go. But to kick things off, Kate, thank you for joining us. What were your thoughts on 2023, and what do you think is next for 2024?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Michael, and lovely to be here with all of my esteemed colleagues, and certainly lots to talk about in 2023. I think my general take on what we saw last year is a lot of, reports that were long awaited and government responses that were long awaited have arrived finally, in particular the Privacy Act response, which was many years in the making. That was a review that was started by the previous government. We finally saw the final report, and then initially, 8 or 9 months later, the government's response to that. We saw, as you mentioned, the cybersecurity strategy and the action plan, and we also saw a lot of work happening on digital ID. We saw very late last year the introduction of the passing of the IVS bill with some privacy amendments. We've also seen changes on introduced for the Online Safety Act, basic online safety expectations. So what you can kind of see is there seems to be a lot of things, a lot of what I'd say activity, but what I haven't seen as much of is what I'd say is action. So we've had a lot of talking, a lot of reports, a lot of strategies, a lot of action plans, but we've had actually very little legislation hit the table. And part of that's probably the stage of government where we've had a change of government, and they've taken a while to kind of get going in terms of putting their place forward. But for consumers, what it's actually meant is the landscape hasn't actually changed all that much in terms of how policies affecting their everyday and their digital lives. But that said, the external environment, as you mentioned, as you said, is kind of massively shifted. Suddenly they're getting all of this hype, trying to talk to consumers even, 1 to 2 years ago about AI, they just weren't interested in it. They didn't understand how it affected their lives. Now they're very concerned about it. Some of the latest research is showing that Australians are some of the most skeptical in the world of how the benefits of AI might actually be real, and whether or not those harms are going to outweigh those benefits. And we're also seeing a lot of concern from consumers about data breaches, really ever since the Optus and Medibank at the end of towards 2022. That concern has continued to build. And we've also seen a huge increase in money lost to scams. And that's something that more and more everyday people are being affected by. So kind of the story, I think, is we've seen, if anyone who's working in the tech policy space is aware that there's a lot of announcements and there's a lot of responses, but I think consumers are really kind of still wondering, why are all of these things still happening? And when is the government going to act to do something about it? So my kind of key prediction, and perhaps it's more of a wish, is that we see some of these things actually translate into bills that pass Parliament and actually then become implemented and actually start improving some of those issues of concern for consumers.
It's interesting on that consumer level and AI awareness that auDA did some research at the end of last year, our third Digital Lives report, that sort of found quite high level of awareness for these technologies, sort of 63% amongst consumers, about 80% amongst small business, but very low level of confidence in explaining those technologies to others. I think it was about 6% for consumers and 12% for small businesses. So what do you think there is to be done around an education piece for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of reflects, again, what we've also been hearing. The consumers are pretty concerned about this. I think what we need to see here is stronger direction and certainty. And I think this is the case for businesses as well. At the moment, there's still a bit of an open question on where a lot of this regulation is going to land and what it's actually going to mean for people. I mean, I think realistically, until we know what the guardrails are going to be, until we know what the rules and regulations are going to be, the education bit almost needs to come after we have that level of certainty. I mean, I certainly think there's some general awareness raising that can be done for people about AI, but I think now that there's a general interest, the public and consumers will start engaging in those issues more broadly. But I think that level of trust is not going to go up until we see that level of certainty and direction, and really having some clear guardrails that make it clear for consumers what those rules are, so that they can trust organisations and businesses' use of AI and also data. And that's where that cybersecurity and privacy piece also comes to play.
Frank, did you have any thoughts on what's for the year ahead, following on from Kate?
Yeah. Look, Kate did a pretty good review of what's some of the things that's coming down the pike for consumers. I just want to go out a little bit and look at other externalities that are really changing and shifting the need for digital, and particularly digital at source and precision and timeliness of data. I see that as a major shift for the tech industry that's continuing, and it's being driven by new things. And the really big new thing is the whole shift to government adopting climate-related financial disclosure, and now doing consultations on sustainability finance. There's a whole lot of work interactions with banking and insurance sectors, which evidently require way better data to actually drive a low carbon economy. You can't do it on generalizations and very rubbery and rough AI on not very granular data. So that, for me, the need is way bigger in that area. And indeed, if we want to go to a circular economy, we need even more. You know, we need consumption, not just production data. And not manually connected, but digitally collected. So there's a huge shift of requiring a lot more data about what we're doing. And that's the sort of the interesting counterpoint that hasn't yet penetrated to consumers yet. We're going to be collecting a lot more. And so so at one side, we need more data to actually run a new economy that we're going to be developing over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And we're going to need to be a lot safer about how we use it. So those are the sort of parallel macro factors that I see. I just wanted to make a couple of interesting comments, some comments, very interesting or not, on the AI side of it a little bit, and on the data breaches. I'm getting the feeling, and I think I'm pleased with the shift myself, that the conversation is becoming way more around transparency and fairness, which is what people really care about. You can discriminate against cohorts of people, but discriminate against individuals another thing, and that's important. And understanding that, I reckon, is part of the key. In terms of data breaches, I reckon it's a bit overblown. I mean, I think there are massive data breaches, but a lot has happened in the tech industry and in businesses for multi-factor authentication and etc. So the actual impact of many of these things is lessening at a bit of a rate. So I think we're overrating, in my mind, the privacy issue and underrating the transparency and trust issue about how data is actually being used. That's more worried about a robo-debt than my details, which frankly are everywhere anyway, being used on services where I already have multi-factor authentication. So I think there's a whole lot of other education to happen. Also, what we've seen is we had the legislation and the of the security for critical infrastructure thing happened 2 years ago, and now last year we had the implementation. So there's an action side on the business side where something like almost 200 industries of critical infrastructure, including water authorities and energy companies, now have to have risk management plans, and now they're introducing actions and plans for how they mitigate and vet their staff and their technology, etc. So that's quite a big shift in industry around their responsibilities for security, which is good to hear. That's continuing on, and that's also the next stage of that's now being discussed within the cybersecurity strategy, as well as what's happening for consumers. That's probably enough at that right now.
Simon, do you have anything to add with you're often in and out of various suites in Parliament House talking to MPs and ministers. What do you think you're going to be knocking on their doors about this year?
Well, as Kate sort of mentioned, with some of these strategies related to the IT industry have been going on for some time. Quantum robotics, cyber, digital and data strategies, AI regulation, Privacy Act, voting MyGov review, migration and skills. There's been a plethora, right? There hasn't been hasn't been boring in terms of trying to put in government submissions and influence and shape these things. But the concern that I have, and have expressed this in a number of different forums recently, is in Australia we're really slow between understanding that something's happening and real. Let's say I'll pick the example of AI because everyone's talking about that, and it is real and it is going to have a major impact in society and our economy. The government strategy and action plan was in 2020. There was funding in 21. We had a change in government. We're now in 2024. There's still no money that has reached industry to support commercialisation. Now, that's too slow for us to be competitive and to respond to these global trends. And it's no surprise then that Australia ranks second last in the league tables when it comes to AI adoption by SMEs across which make up 80–90% of our economy, right? So it's great that Minister Husick's announced the AI Adopt Centre programs, which is trying to focus on that. $17 million, great. But other countries, our international competitors and trading partners are spending 500 million, $500 million plus. So, you know, we are hopeful that there will be additional funding in the May budget. So that's, I think, something to look out for. The regulation side of it is really important as well, to get the guardrails, to get that consumer confidence that Frank and Kate spoke to. We're supportive of that. And that has been a well-considered and thoughtful process. The Privacy Act, I agree with Kate. We've been critical. It's taken years. It's just madness to update the Privacy Act. It's pleasing that it deals with things like AI and ADM, automatic decision making, and there'll be that transparency piece in relation to decisions that are made by banks and other entities in relation to using AI to determine whether you're eligible for something or not. These are things to get right, and government needs to get its own house in order in relation to adoption of these tools, you know, through direct private sort of discussions and lobbying. You know, the government has set up a task force, an interdepartmental task force, to set up an AI task force around adoption and use of AI itself. RoboDebt wasn't technically AI, but you can see what can happen if things go wrong, if there isn't some good governance controls and processes. So these are really, really important things around trust of these technologies and tools, AI in particular. We know, and the other thing we need to do as an industry is tie these technologies to the productivity agenda of the government. You know, Treasury is not going to fund these things for the Department of Industry and believe in them if it doesn't tie back to the productivity agenda and the economy. And there's enough data, reports out there. There's so many use cases around AI. AI and generative AI, large language, it's not another blockchain where there's a massive hype curve and going, oh, what are the use cases? They're minimal and narrow. I still think blockchain's got a way to go, but in terms of it's got utility. But AI is different. Productivity Commission recognises that. So I could talk at length about what needs to happen, and happy to do that. But we know, just to finish on this point, because a bit of a sneak peek, we're releasing a tech index, Australia's first ever tech procurement index, on Monday. And we have data from CIOs and people who procure technology across the economy. I've never seen this feedback ever, and it's in our report, that they are concerned around government policy in relation to, and it's probably mostly around cyber and AI and the regulation that's now coming in in industry and across the economy, whereas it hasn't happened before, and they are not sure where government is going. And we know that there's further laws and regulations that are going to be coming to Parliament this year on both AI and both cybersecurity. There'll be two pieces of legislation on cybersecurity this year. We've heard there will be in the spring sittings and in the autumn sittings that is going to put increased onuses and responsibilities in relation to cyber breaches as a result of Medibank and Optus last year. So there's a lot there to unpack, but I just wanted to give that overview that we need to do better. We need to accelerate decision-making of government and the funding. And we need to have well-targeted, well-thought-through regulation, which the government on the whole is doing, but noting that there is an impact on regulation across the economy where it's not well considered and thought through. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Simon. And I sort of caused me to think, what more you think government needs to do in these areas, considering particularly that it feels like last year we're only just wrapping up inquiries into big tech, inquiries into social media. There's always that underlying current of what are the algorithms doing on these big tech platforms, and it seems like we've just launched straight into another one with a fair bit of before even sort of finishing up this last batch. So how do you think government needs to rejig the way they do things, and how do you think they should go about it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there needs to be better coordination. Technology doesn't sit neatly in one portfolio, right? It sits across the whole economy, sits across all the portfolios. So there's a bit of left hand, right hand. We've called for better tech policy coordination and creating some sort of central government entity. It doesn't have to be a whole body with boards and things like that. Government doesn't like that. But there needs to be a better way. And we hope that the announcement of the cyber policy coordinator would lead to better coordination as a result of a cyber breach by the different arms of government that keep asking. You know, we got feedback from our member, a telco, in relation to a large breach. They were inundated many months later by requests from 5, 6, 7 government departments for the same data. And we thought the coordinator would result in a better coordinated approach by government. Sadly, we were told by the coordinator who's not there, and a new one's been announced yesterday. But that's not going to happen. So it's a coordinator in name only, with no power, and is a uniform that's going to stand up in front of press conferences after a breach, right? That's a cynical side of me. But I think that's not an unshared view across our membership, right? So I think government needs to do better. Digital identity is a really interesting one, right? There's legislation for a committee at the moment. Both sides of politics support it. Let's just get on with it, right? There's some no-brainers out there that just are on the slow burn. And again, in that digital identity legislation, it's going to unlock a bunch of citizen benefits. It's going to unleash a lot of benefits for the economy. But it's deprioritized. The finance minister is a very busy person. It sits in her portfolio for whatever reason. She's supporting it, but there's a 3-stage process, and it's going to take years for it to be fully implemented across the economy once the legislation gets approved. So yeah, there's a sense of, I think government can prioritize and focus on some of these things a bit more.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up, if I may, on one point that Simon raised, and that's on adoption. And this has been a bugbear of mine, for years, actually. And the governments are, generally speaking, appalling at dealing with adoption. They pour some, but not enough, money into invention. And they do work on legislation and rules, which is fair enough. It's right smack bang in the middle. But they find adoption really not sort of their responsibility. Market will somehow work it out. They are a third of the market. They are also part of enabling the market to work, because they need to enable, the digital infrastructure, the telecoms to support digitalization. All it has to be put into place that it all supports one another. And we have to have a trusted community so that adoption isn't prevented by people being too scared and I think that's a necessarily collaborative role. It's not government telling people you shall adopt, that won't work, but working with industry and everyone else about what's good and how you're doing it, and then demonstrating and doing it themselves, and dare I say it, buying Australian, is part of that magic. Now, it's not that magical because most Asian countries are doing it. For me, that's probably one of the big missing elements is government actually grappling with the adoption problem. And we don't rank where we ought to in adoption. We just don't. And for me, we have a high standard of living which we want to maintain. In my personal view, we're not going to maintain it by reducing wages. We've got to do it by being smarter, being data smarter. It's simple as that. And we're not going to invent new technology to replace it without having the interconnected fabric of data to make it work. That's so fundamental. So that's a conversation, Simon, that I think I'd love to really accelerate. And of course, that's cross department. And there's no one entity that knows or thinks it's responsible.
Yeah, look, I think, I understand government has got processes, rules, and procurements that are slow and cumbersome, and you've got to accept that there's good reasons for that. But I just think we need to have reflect on our economy and productivity and where we're at and what our global peers are doing that we're not doing, and come up with mechanisms that can hasten the process between identifying the problem and the strategy and execution. And there are ways to do that with some creative thinking, creating some innovation funds where the budget is sit there and government agencies can tap into that for supporting Australian tech companies in emerging tech areas and critical tech areas. We've signed up to international Quad, forums like the Quad and AUKUS. And there's also a disconnect, this is probably going off on a tangent, between defence industry and the rest of the economy industry policy, where we're a small country, there's only so many PhDs in AI and quantum. Can we have a dual defence industry policy and the rest of the economy policy? Probably not, but they're kind of separated in this country. And there's some big thinking that needs to take place and done fairly quickly. And
Kate, from a consumer perspective, a few points from what sort of Frank and Simon were raising about actions of government. Is there sort of confusion about what's good and what's not good in terms of AI? I feel like there's a lot of negative that tends to come down. There's a lot of regulation in terms of which I feel like a lot of the message might be coming to consumers looking to control AI for their protection. But Is there enough sense coming down for the benefits? Like what more do you think government and industry could do for that consumer confidence side, and to say, well, this is how it's good rather than how it's bad?
Yeah, well, I'll pick up on a couple of things that Simon and Frank have said. You know, I totally agree with Simon on the fact for a more coordinated and cohesive response from government. Tech policy, the reason why we've all been so busy working tech policy is it cuts across every portfolio. Like, it's everywhere. It's in consumers' everyday lives. And that's one of the things I talk about as the consumer data advocate, is that, you know, I'm really heavily focused on the ways that data interacts with people's lives in ways that they can't avoid. You don't like what Facebook's doing, get off Facebook. But realistically, people engage in data and digital when they do their supermarket shopping, when they travel on the train to go to work, when they go about their jobs. Like, it is literally in every aspect of our lives now. And so I think without having that coordinated response across government, then consumers don't feel that trust in government's decision making. And what it can mean is that we can see sometimes conflicting decisions. So I'll call out, say, the cybersecurity strategy and the Privacy Act in relation to data breach and how they treated those. So we saw post Optus and Medibank the introduction of some really, really stiff penalties in an amendment bill that introduced penalties up to $20 million for data breaches. But then at the same time, the cybersecurity strategy comes out and it's trying to go more with a safe harbor approach by saying to organizations, if you have this incident happening, you tell us as soon as possible, we can catch the bad guys and you won't be at fault and nothing bad will happen to you. And in fact, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner had to then come out and say, hey, we don't think this is necessarily great in terms of organizations meeting their obligations for data minimization and privacy by design. You're really kind of giving them a get out of jail free card. And that's not what consumers' expectations are. You know, and I think in relation to that, I would probably disagree with Frank in that data breaches aren't that impactful. For the individuals who they happen to, they can be incredibly stressful. And particularly when it relates to things like health insurance or telco or those really essential services that people rely on, and particularly in terms of digital inclusion, many people don't have that level of digital literacy that they know and be able to interact with these services. So people who might only have a fairly limited digital footprint in terms of telco and health insurance maybe don't know about multi-factor authentication. And certainly organizations, I don't think individually are doing enough to encourage people into that. I think if you look at recently the 23andMe breach, that was the genetic company that links people's family histories together. They essentially blamed that on users and said because users were using the same username and password that had then been leaked on other organizations' websites, they were enabled to do a credential stuffing attack on 23andMe. But the consequences of that meant that a large data set of people who identified as Ashkenazi Jews was then leaked on the dark web, which you can see the implications can be pretty severe in a current situation where there is a war in Palestine led by Israel. So these are not small consequences. So there's individual consequences and there's large geopolitical consequences. I think we've got a really, really important lesson here to learn with the huge increase in scams is directly linked to our poor data minimization and our poor cybersecurity practices of the past. The fact is the dark web is full of everyone's information. I think that's what Frank is referring to, is like the horse is bolted, right? Like this is actually all out there and it's in the hands of cyber criminals. But this is the lesson I think that we can learn on AI is if we don't think what can a very small group of bad actors do with this technology. We talk a lot about data democratization. We talk about getting AI in the hands of everybody, but we have to acknowledge the fact that when we mean everybody, we mean also some people with not good intentions who are looking to exploit and manipulate. And ultimately, without strong action from government, it's going to be ordinary people who really bear the brunt of that. You know, today in Canberra, a group of scam victims who've lost in the tens of thousands of dollars have gone to Canberra to meet with politicians who try and explain their side of the story. And It's an incredibly traumatic experience for the people that it happens to. And the reality is it can happen to anyone. I saw just yesterday on X, or formerly Twitter, that Cory Doctorow, who anyone who knows about his work, he's like incredibly knowledgeable about tech. He writes science fiction, but he also writes book about tech. He got scammed recently. You know, so it literally, if it can happen to Cory Doctorow, it can really happen to anyone. So I think that, you know, I acknowledge that it's very complicated from the government side, but really here trying to represent those ordinary consumer voices, that this is incredibly impactful, incredibly damaging, and we can learn the lessons, I think, from the past in cybersecurity and apply them to AI in recognizing that there will be people who want to do the wrong thing. Many organizations and businesses will want to do the right thing, and we do want to get that confidence and trust, but we need to act now to try and protect people in every way we can from those bad actors.
Okay, we would agree with that. The tech industry, and certainly as with those telcos, we said we've got as members of the auDA, they've been part of those high-profile breaches. It's interesting. I think we've shifted, as you've alluded to, from data, personalized data being digital gold and the oil rush of the 21st century through to a digital liability that you can hold too much, and cleaning up, you know, either the retention laws and things is really, really important. That provide that legislative and legal clarity as to what you need to keep legally if you're a telco, for example. It was important to update those laws, and absolutely agree that digital privacy is really, really important. Strengthening the Privacy Act, we're incredibly supportive of. Just in terms of cybersecurity, and the examples you give around different rules and confusion, you're 100% right. And that goes to better coordination, right? And that is, if you're the Office of Information Privacy Commissioner, if it's data, again, I think it's within 24 hours you got to notify, and then under other breaches it's 48 hours, and under other acts it might be 7 days. So there's all these different rules, and it could be the same breach, but you got to report to different entities for different breaches. So again, we're hoping a cyber coordinator could actually bring all that together. But when new legislation is being drafted, you know, it'd be great to sort of align all of those. The safe harbour you mentioned, the government's not going down that road. They're calling it limited use. We never suggested that it would be get out of jail free card for negligence in relation to securing people's data. But what we would hope that we want to actually encourage those who can't cope with a breach that's significant, that they go to government for help. So you want to create an environment where they reach out and don't hide it and pretend it didn't happen. But you also, so what the government's proposing, we heard this from Home Affairs last week in a roundtable we had with them, is a limited use concept where you can actually come to help. The concern we don't have clarity on is around the regulator can still regulate and go after you if through lax controls and not doing what you're supposed to do. But if you make that information available to be assisted in defending and patching, then that shouldn't be held against you and shouldn't be forwarded on. That regulator can still seek that information directly. So there's some detail to be worked through there. But these are all the settings we need to get right so that industry has got confidence. And then from the tech industry, we're called the data storage and processing sector, which doesn't have a home in government. There's no minister responsible for it, which goes to the point Kate was making about we don't, you know, where does digital economy and where does this innovation policy sit? It sits everywhere. But, you know, we need, you know, if a breach happens by Optus or Medibank or a logistics company, you know, the responsibility should sit with the end user rather than a data center provider, unless there's a lax control in the data center. But we're talking about these global platforms that are pretty robust. Usually the breaches have always been in those big high profile cases, poor user access control, right? The weakest link's usually the person having no passwords or really weak passwords, and then you can access the whole network when they should have been partitioned and only be able to access what they needed to access to. But agree with what you're saying, Kate. The citizen data, we need to get these things right because it comes down to trust in the economy.
One good thing I'd say that's happening, and it's something that we've been supporting for years, and that the government's moving to introduce minimum standards for consumer IoT devices. which is a really, really good thing. We got to weed out the bad actors, and that's very, very pleasing indeed, I reckon. We're not the first in the world, but we're not far behind a very small handful of countries that are doing it now. So I think that's a really excellent piece of news. It's going to be more complicated. These things security is always complicated. But it'll at least set a minimum threshold at the start, and then we can start ratcheting up what it means. We think having a minimum standard is one thing. One thing that we're strongly pushing and the government's considering and working through is we also need some sort of way of telling the consumer how secure these devices are, which means possibly a labeling scheme that's beyond the minimum. In other words, if everything's the minimum, what's actually appropriate? What's appropriate for this sort of thing? Is it whole personal data? Is it something that's in a dangerous situation, or does it not matter? Is it my light bulb going on? That's a really big conversation. But we're at the starting point of consumers maybe now starting to understand what that might even mean. So I really welcome the conversations around that, because I think my general observation from talking for people overseas is that the Australian consumers aren't quite as aware as others in other countries about some of these things. They're scared. They might be just as scared, maybe more scared, but they're not as aware because I don't know, many reasons. So maybe it's a cultural thing, but it's also an educational thing. And something like introducing minimum standards and everything else starts the conversation going. And I think that's a really good thing.
Frank, just for people who may not be aware, those minimum standards and around connected devices, that's in the cybersecurity legislation that's been going. There's two tranches of it I referred to earlier, so that'll be picked up there, which is good. Yep,
it's definitely going to happen. It'll take a year and a half or so to actually happen, but it's gonna. But the beautiful thing is that the decision's been made, legislation will be set. So yeah, ball rolling.
But you can get this flavour though that there's, after the SOCI SONs, there's two new pieces of legislation coming just in cyber. There's AI regulation coming. There's some good changes happening in digital identity. Hopefully it'll take a while to filter through years as well. But there's a lot of things going on. As you can see why in that survey I mentioned that there are people in the industry going, geez, what's government doing? There's a wave after wave of regulation. Now, most of it justified and very good. A couple of pieces that we would disagree with, but on the whole, we're supportive. And the Privacy Act changes too. But there's a lot for everyone to absorb, which I think we need to be mindful of.
And it is interesting, again, the auDA's research has also shown that there is this, though there's this heightened concern about cybersecurity and people's data being stolen, our previous Digital Lives report also showed that consumers don't really know where to go for that source of truth with this information. And we've had a question come in, well, a question/comment coming from Anthony, so talking about how his clients are constantly emailing him asking, is this a real email? Is this a scam? He says he keeps on reporting these things to ScamWatch and Google Safe Browsing. But from our, as I said, our research that shows there's no source of truth that people point to. They jump onto a search engine and Google it, which if the trusted resource comes up first, that's great. But if it doesn't, that's not necessarily a good thing. So, Kate, I guess there are a lot of places people can go to report stuff. A lot of places people can go to find information. But what could we do more to really be creating that point that people know I can trust this, and this is the best practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot going on in that question, and I think we can see one of the challenges with scams is that the second you report them something, it goes away and something else pops up in its place. It's that real kind of whack-a-mole problem. That being said, the ACCC has indicated that one of the best ways to fight scams is more data. Frank would agree, I'm sure. That the more that people report, that is actually useful. They can get better insight to what kind of scams are coming up, and they can issue consumer warnings. In terms of trusted information, I think this is where we can see where the impact of generative AI might actually be working against us in terms of creating that trust. So if we start to see more search engines and Google using Bard and Microsoft Bing, etc., using the OpenAI GPT-4, using generative search, we know that that's less reliable. And in fact, people might be getting less and less reliable answers when they search online than they even have been in the past. You know, I think when search kind of first came out, it was not that trusted. There was a lot of junk, but over the years, I mean, search now has been around, what, 25 years. It has been giving pretty high quality results. Google in particular has spent a huge amount of money investing of how to get that EAT, EAT now, I think they have, they keep adding letters to it, but the expertness, the authoritativeness, the trustworthiness of that information. And we may see that begin to unravel once generative AI hits search. We really haven't got across the problems of mis and disinformation in search. And again, so this idea of reliable information, and I'll just call out kind of two things on that. One is the fact that we're seeing some really convincing deep fakes. I don't know if anyone saw that story this week of a company that was scammed out of, I think it was 40 million Australian dollars by a deep fake CFO on a video meeting. That's not something that's on people's awareness. Deep fakes, misinformation, disinformation is going to be a bigger problem coming into it. So again, there's trusted sources of information. I'll call out Choice because I can as a trusted source of consumer information, and we work really, really closely with the regulators, ACCC and ASIC, and also the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, as well as ACMA, etc., on making sure that we can create that trusted information for consumers and that there's a safe place for them to go. That being said, though, we're no measure for the amount of wrong information on the internet. Like, this is the volume problem, right? Of how much misinformation is out there, but it's how the reliable sources is getting smaller and smaller. I saw this story last year, which is just kind of like a little funny anecdote, but kind of has serious implications, is that there's now all of these mushroom foraging books on Amazon, which are entirely created using generative AI. But the information they have in them is wrong. It's telling people to go and pick mushrooms that might, in fact, be harmful for them. So how is anyone to know, buying a book about mushroom foraging on Amazon, that they're buying one that's written by a legitimate expert versus one that's entirely written by generative AI with fake authors and fake expert profiles on fake websites? So it's just one little kind of indication of where we're at in terms of understanding trusted information, and it is getting incredibly hard for individual people to be able to distinguish the real from the fake. So in answer to that question, yes, please keep reporting things, but are we keeping up? Probably not right now is the answer.
Yeah, look, that's interesting, Kate, and I think that's we haven't had much or anything, no discussions really on data provenance. And that's a creeping one, and there's a lot of stuff happening in the EU around data provenance right now. It's a fiendish thing to deal with, but my gut feel is that this is going to be a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger issue. Data provenance for industry is like fundamental. You know, when you look at the sensors you have and the data in there, and you have to get rid of the outliers and all sort of stuff, and there's a lot of AI around that, and that's a controlled environment. Fundamental. That's how the industry works. But broadening that out, that's a big one. And so indeed, I think a bit hard to say which is going to be a bigger problem, but that's a big one.
Can I just a couple of things that listening to that conversation, really interesting, is the digital identity legislation. It's proposed to provide a secure way of proving your identity to get services so that your private data doesn't get leaked or hacked. So you can prove your identity without having to provide you all those credentials to a real estate agent or to a bank or telco. So I think that's going to have some utility in the economy once it's rolled out, which is a good thing. A really interesting data point, going to Kate's point around generative AI and search, 50% of the source of the truth for GPT is Wikipedia. So if you think that Wikipedia is the gospel, then that probably, and is the source of truth of all things, then you've probably got a problem. But that probably gives you an indication as to where it's drawing most of its data from at the moment. Now, ChatGPT is going to have exponential growth and get more data hoovered into it and will get better over time. But that just probably gives people pause for thought in terms of the accuracy of these algorithms and the data sets.
I'll just add another little interesting anecdote. I also read recently that many of the large newspaper and media outlets have stopped web scraping, so have stopped the scraping of their sites, and so obviously including the New York Times, which is in litigation with OpenAI, but many of the other what we will consider reputable sources, but those that haven't tend to be the very, very far right wing, the Breitbart and the Newsmax. So you can kind of see if then the only news data or the media data that is being sucked up and scraped for these generative AI programs is only a very narrow section of the political spectrum, you can then see how that bias and that misinformation can creep in even unaware for the people who are building the bot. So you think you're getting, larger, and the larger the data set, yes, probably the more accurate it's going to be. But we're starting to see some of these problems kind of enter into that data provenance pipeline. We might not see the results of them. And, in the geopolitical landscape, this is one of the largest election years will be. So it's kind of a world-shaping year. So the fact that we're not on top of the mis and disinformation problem, I think, is going to be kind of really critical, and it's just so far away from what the average everyday Australian consumer is really thinking about. So in that sense, I do really feel for the challenge of government at the moment. Is there are some really big thorny issues, and they're all kind of interconnected up, and that's where we kind of need to come back to that coordinated and cohesive response. And it's not the way that governments generally are used to working. They're used to kind of having divided portfolios, and I really think we need to start thinking more creatively about how we do government and how we do whole of government policy, because the world has changed, and we need to be able to respond to that, to be able to meet the needs of our citizens and consumers.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a great question there. Sorry, I just thought I answered the question. It's kind of right. It will take AI tools to beat AI when it comes to cyber and privacy breaches. So our industry is already providing some solutions and tools to beat the baddies, the bad actors. The reality is the bad actors always tend to be one step ahead, and it is a bit of a catch up, but it will take AI to beat AI, and those tools are already in the market.
Yeah, and on the data provenance thing, one of the areas that's hot and that needs to be addressed, and the government is working on it right now, is the data provenance of carbon offsets, and looking, and that's again a question of collecting the right amount of data which isn't being collected, and also authenticating it. And I think that there's a transparency and a requirement for openness that we're going to need to get from people who create the offsets, etc., etc. So there's a bit of work to be done there. The technology can so evidently do it, and so it actually requires some rules and that people follow, so that we can actually trust it. Otherwise, we won't be, we won't be getting carbon neutral. We're getting a little less than neutral.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to call out, then go back to what Frank said earlier about standards. I think there's a real role for standards here. And I certainly agree with Frank that there's very welcome to introduce minimum standards in IoT and connected devices. I think that's really, really positive step, and that's something that can create consumer trust. And now, I'm also a member of as a consumer representative of the AI Standards Committee, and we've certainly started to see a big pipeline of standards coming through in AI. And I think if the government were to move to make some of those standards mandatory, that could have a similar effect in enabling that consumer trust to return, but also providing certainty for businesses that they were all working to the same standard. At the moment, I think there is a bit of confusion because we've got the government's announcing that they're going to create their own AI safety standard, but yet we know that there's an existing ISO standard, particularly around risk management, which is 42001, which will be very soon published in Australia. It's been published internationally, as well as there's some NIST standards. Probably people in certain sections of the ICT industry are more familiar with working with NIST than ISO, but there's certainly standards available. So I think that is an option that the government should really consider in terms of making that cohesion across industry and making that interoperability. I mean, I think that's why my preference would be for international standards over an Australian specific standard. But in any case, I think any move towards minimum standards, any words towards mandatory standards really helps to uplift consumer trust, and really sets where the kind of baseline expectation is for organisations.
I think this question before about what's in these large language models is going to be one we'll be talking about for I think a fair bit of this year, and some interesting observations in a report that we put out last year that we commissioned with some researchers from CSIRO's Data 61 and the University of Technology Sydney, which we published as Atlas of Australia Online report. It was noted the high influence of Australian websites in Google's large language model, and part of the research actually sort of looked at, well, what's likely being picked up by these other large language models, and is there a way of predicting it? And Australia's has quite a high degree. Australian websites have quite a high degree of network centrality. This report also found. So there's the hope that a lot of Australian websites and good Australian content is ending up in these models. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves going forward. But I'll chuck a link to that report in the chat too, because there's, amongst other things, that's an interesting point to think about is, well, where are these coming from, and where's the bias going to be towards? And maybe it's towards Australia, which could work out quite well for us globally. So there's my little bit of optimism. But like, I think this sort of as we sort of move to the tail end of our time together, I just thought I'd sort of come back to this question of industry and what more industry could do, because Kate, particularly you mentioned the 23andMe data breach and blaming it on consumers. There is a trend towards by some of the big tech companies to get rid of passwords and move to things like pass keys and things that can't be phished. So should we be chucking things back on 23andMe and saying, why are you still using passwords?
Look, yeah, I mean, I think important thing to think about consumers, I do agree with Frank that there is growing awareness, and I think over time consumers will become more educated and more engaged. But the reality is that you shouldn't need to become an AI expert or a tech expert just to go about your daily business and to interact with the world. We've all probably got toilets in our home. I don't know how the toilet works, but I know that I can call a plumber when it breaks. I know when it breaks, I know I can call the plumber and they'll come and fix it. And I expect them to be certified. I expect them to meet minimum standards. I expect the government to create rules about how the plumbing system should work. So I think we can take that kind of principle to how technology should work in everyday people's life. So the basic question of should 23andMe be blaming users for their poor password management? No, absolutely not. They're a company that holds genetic information, and a company whose business model is created by linking up people's family history. They should have known that that was a honeypot. And if they saw people not changing their passwords or having passwords that were leaked, they should be monitoring that, and they should be prompting their users. Or, as you say, they should be using a different type of credential that they can. Look, I think digital ID, as Simon pointed out, is a really, really big step forward. I think it's got huge benefits for consumers. It can be something that's really, really simple for consumers to use. They don't necessarily need to understand every aspect of it. It means that some of these problems will go away in the future, but it's definitely not consumers and end users' job to fix this problem. It's the people who are making the money out of the business who are suffering that breach. They're the ones who are ultimately responsible.
Yeah, and I think some of the Privacy Act recognises a little bit more of the shifting of responsibility for providing responsible service or a good service, as well as getting the consumer to say yes to whatever the answer is. The very important and undecipherable question. So I think the rebalancing is an important one. And so indeed the opportunity for new technologies, frankly, is on the responsible service provider, obviously. And so I think that there's education to be done there. And dare I say, the government has a role in that as well. I mean, what's good look like? What's no longer acceptable? And it's fiendishly hard to get through to industry because we're all everywhere. But that's why they need to work with industry. not just declare the answer, because it's not enough. That's why you need the coordination and the collaboration that Simon's been talking about, and you've been talking about. Utterly vital, and it never stops. It doesn't stop at. It doesn't happen at one consultation. It happens all the time. That's how it works, if it works well.
Well, I'd be amiss, Frank, if I didn't chuck in a question to you at the tail end. And we did have you on a webinar, might have been early last year or the year before. And I'm interested whether anything has changed. Should I be more or less worried about saying anything around Alexa now than I was before?
Oh man. Look, I don't know I can answer that question, to tell you the truth. I think that there are more controls, but there are more smart people who can attack it as well. I think that there are, like everything else, there are good and bad services, and I wouldn't be able to stand here and say, no. Generally speaking, I'd be quite happy to order a pizza on Alexa, but I wouldn't necessarily order my car or do my banking or anything like that on it. That's my personal opinion, and ironically, I'm a bit of a tech Luddite, even though I love tech.
But it goes to the national security issue, though, when you take it up from the Alexa ordering pizza example to your connected home, to your connected logistics, to your connected economy, to your solar, smart grids. So you can see why government's very exercised to make sure that we do, through the supply chain of the technology sector, that there's no vulnerabilities for the economy. But we just need regulation to be targeted, well thought through, and appropriate.
No, I'll throw to you for the last word, Simon. And I just need to bring on the appropriate regulation, and bearing in mind we've about a minute left. Do you think there's a lot going on between state and federal governments as to play between who should be involved in what space? There's a lot of state digital ministers now, but yet a lot of the regulation seems to sit with the federal government. Do you think there's going to be that toing and froing as to who should be playing what role?
Yes, and look, I speak to the state ministers, and it's patchy across Australia. There's a bit of a dual speed. Some of the states just wait for the feds to move, and then other states are frustrated with the feds and move anyway. Like New South Wales is a great example. They created an AI framework. They did the cyber security stuff before the feds. They did the digital identity piece, letting the country. So you are getting, and Victoria is not far behind on many of these things as well. The other states are probably a lot slower on going, oh, we'll just wait for the feds to regulate an AI and then we'll come in behind that. So it's at different stages. The Digital and Data Ministerial Meeting, the DDMM, I think is the right vehicle to make sure we have joined up, and the digital identity piece is an important part of that. But to come back to this speed issue, quarterly meetings, come together, kick it down the road. I think we do need to move faster on some of these matters, and government needs to invest in the right areas.
Thank you for that. And I think with 1 minute to go to the hour, I think it's time we bring things to a close. So thank you for all your contributions today to this dynamic conversation. I think we could have gone on for another half an hour, and I'm looking forward to further chats with you all at a later stage. But as always at auDA, we like to remind everyone that if you'd like to find out more about these exciting topics and other things that we have going on, we strongly encourage you to sign up as a .au member. Details are there on the screen. You can join via our website. And I did mention today a few different reports and things that auDA has published. They're on our website. Encourage people to look up our 2023 to 24 public policy agenda. Our quarterly public policy reports that provide a snapshot of what's happened in the previous quarter, and internationally our internet governance roadmap. We also have a number of blogs and regular posts we put up there. And for other things up on the cards, we've got a few more webinars still to go this month. Encourage you all to put them in your diaries. We've got a discussion on trademarks and domain names on the 14th of Feb. And on the 20th of Feb, we've got a cybersecurity strategy discussion with Hamish Hansford, Brendan Dowling, and Rachel Falk to really get into the cybersecurity strategy and its implementation. So thank you all for joining us, both panel and attendees, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar or around out and about in the real world. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.